The county deputy showed up at my lower gate at 8:42 on a cold Tuesday morning with a homeowners association president in the passenger seat, a picture of my warning sign in his hand, and the tired look of a man who had been told he was about to settle a neighborhood argument before lunch. The woman beside him, Marla Whitcomb, stepped out first, wearing a cream-colored riding vest and sunglasses too expensive for a gravel road, and before that poor deputy could even say good morning, she pointed at my gate and said, "That sign is fake. It is scaring our residents, and I want him cited for impersonating federal authority." I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I just opened the old leather document case my wife bought me back when I still had brown hair, pulled out one certified federal memorandum, slid it through the bars of the gate, and watched the deputy read just enough of it to turn pale around the ears. My name is Caleb Harlan. I am 66 years old, and until that morning I had spent most of my life believing the best way to handle trouble was to let trouble announce itself first, because trouble almost always walks in loud, overdressed, and sure it is smarter than everybody else. I was born in a little mountain town outside Elkins, West Virginia, in a house that smelled like wood smoke, coffee, wet boots, and the kind of silence families keep when everybody knows some piece of land has a story attached to it. My older brother, Amos, inherited the Harlan farm from our parents in 1987, and he kept it the way our father had kept it. Mostly hay, some cattle, a few acres of timber, one spring pond, and one stretch of southern pasture nobody in our family ever crossed unless they had a uniform, a clipboard, and a very good reason. That pasture sat behind a rusted wire fence at the bottom of a long slope, pretty enough from a distance, especially in October when the grass turned silver in the morning frost. But my grandfather used to say pretty land can still remember ugly things, and that piece remembered World War II better than any history book on my shelf. From 1943 to 1945, the Army leased those lower acres from my grandfather, Samuel Harlan, for a training range tied to a temporary mountain camp that most people forgot about before Eisenhower was president. They fired shells into that hillside, tested range angles, ran young soldiers through drills, packed up when the war ended, and sent my grandfather a letter saying the land had been cleared. 2 years later, he found out how cleared it was when his mower blade hit a buried shell and the blast took his left foot, half his hearing, and every peaceful Sunday morning he ever had after that. He survived, because Harlan men are apparently too stubborn to die on schedule, but he came home from the Veterans Hospital with a cane, a limp, and the hatred of government paperwork so cold and quiet it never needed profanity. My father grew up hearing the same rule every spring, every Thanksgiving, every time a cousin wanted to chase a deer across the south fence. You do not go in the lower meadow. You do not cut across it. You do not hunt it. You do not picnic there, and if somebody asks why, you tell them the Army left business unfinished. Amos took that rule like scripture. He repainted the warning boards every few years, walked the boundary with federal engineers whenever they came through, and kept a file in a locked cedar chest under his bed that had more federal seals in it than most county courthouses. When Amos died of a heart attack in his kitchen in late summer, I came home to settle the estate and ended up sitting on his floor for 2 nights, reading everything he had guarded for nearly 40 years. I had retired from the Department of the Interior, where I spent 3 decades dealing with contaminated public lands, old mineral sites, abandoned government parcels, and the sort of property problems that do not go away just because somebody builds a subdivision beside them and plants hydrangeas. So when I opened Amos's cedar chest and saw the 1998 federal land use restriction, the unexploded ordnance reports, the inspection notes, the maps, the photographs, and the letter from my father telling Amos never to let strangers into the south pasture, I understood exactly what I was holding. It was not family folklore. It was not mountain superstition. It was federal law, wrapped in old paper and sitting under a dead man's bed. That was the part Marla Whitcomb never bothered to learn. Or maybe she learned it and decided it was inconvenient, which in my experience is how half of all disasters start. Marla was president of Alder Creek Estates, the gated community built along the eastern side of our farm, 58 homes with stone mailboxes, fake carriage lamps, and residents who called deer wildlife until the deer ate their roses, then called them a public nuisance. Alder Creek had been marketed as peaceful mountain living with meadow views, and over time those meadow views became, in Marla's newsletters, our shared green space, then our community meadow, then the heritage field, which was a fancy way of saying land that did not belong to them but looked nice in a brochure. I first met Marla at the feed store parking lot 2 weeks after Amos's funeral. She walked right up to me while I was loading fence staples into my truck and said, "Caleb, we are so relieved you are finally managing the property. Your brother was very difficult about access." She said difficult the way some people say contagious. I told her Amos was careful, not difficult, and she smiled like she had already forgiven me for not understanding how important she was. Then she explained that Alder Creek families had been using the lower meadow for seasonal gatherings for years. Egg hunts, movie nights, a harvest picnic, a junior nature club, nothing disruptive, just wholesome community life. And she hoped I would not let outdated concerns interfere with neighborly goodwill. I remember looking at her hands while she talked. Perfect nails, diamond bracelet, phone buzzing every 10 seconds, and thinking she had the polished confidence of someone who had never had a piece of paper tell her no. I asked her who'd given the HOA permission to use my land. She laughed, not a big laugh, just a small little puff of air, like I had misunderstood the grown-up part of the conversation. She said, "Oh, Caleb, it has always been an understanding. Now, an understanding is a dangerous word in rural land disputes, because it usually means one person remembers asking and the other person remembers saying absolutely not." I told her there was no understanding, and until I finished reviewing the federal restrictions, nobody was to cross that fence. Her smile thinned out. She said, "I would hate for the community to feel unwelcome." I said, "Marla, the community is welcome to enjoy land it owns." That one landed badly. For the next month, I got emails from her, then letters from the HOA board, then a note from their attorneys suggesting my refusal to permit access might damage established community expectations. That phrase made me laugh so hard I had to sit down at the kitchen table. Established community expectations. My grandfather lost a foot in that field. My brother spent 40 years keeping children out of it. And somehow the dangerous part was that Marla's picnic committee might need a new location for cider donuts. But I still did not go public. I called the federal office listed on the old memorandum, reached a range safety coordinator named Denise Calder, and within 10 minutes of hearing the property name, her voice changed. Not alarmed exactly, but focused. She asked me if I was sitting down. I told her I had spent 30 years in federal land administration and preferred bad news standing up. She said, "Mr. Harlan, Alder Creek Estates has received 5 certified federal warnings since 2019 about unauthorized use of that restricted pasture. The first one was signed for by Marla Whitcomb personally." I looked out the kitchen window toward the south fence, where the frost was melting off the wire, and I felt something in me go still. Denise kept talking, but for a few seconds all I could hear was my grandfather's cane tapping across the porch in my childhood memory. Tap, drag, tap, drag. The sound of a man carrying proof in his own body. Then Denise said the sentence that changed the whole shape of my life. She said, "Mr. Harlan, we have been waiting for a landowner willing to cooperate." I wish I could tell you I felt brave when Denise Calder said that, like some old Western character finally handed the badge and told to clean up town. But the truth is I felt tired first, then angry, then something stranger than anger, something closer to grief. Because if those warnings were real, and if Marla had signed for them, then every picnic blanket, every folding chair, every child running after plastic eggs in that grass had been placed there by somebody who knew better. I asked Denise to send me everything she could legally release, and by noon the next day I had a stack of scanned federal letters in my inbox, each one addressed to Alder Creek Estates Homeowners Association, each one warning that the South Pasture remained an active restricted defense legacy site, each one carrying language dry enough to cure meat but clear enough for a county jury to understand. No digging, no gatherings, no recreational use, no entry beyond posted boundaries, and at the bottom of each certified receipt was Marla Whitcomb's signature, looping and proud, the same way she signed HOA newsletters about preserving our mountain lifestyle. That afternoon I sat at Amos's kitchen table with those printouts spread around me like a bad hand of cards. I had the old stove ticking behind me, rain tapping on the tin porch roof, and my wife's photograph propped on the windowsill where I had placed it after moving back. Her name was Ellen. She had died 3 years earlier from ovarian cancer, and she had been the kind of woman who could find the clean moral line in any mess faster than a lawyer could find the billable hour. I looked at her picture and said, "Well, Ellie, apparently I moved home just in time to become a nuisance." I could almost hear her answer, "Caleb, you were always a nuisance. Now you just have documents." The federal range safety team arrived the following Monday in 2 white trucks. Denise Calder came herself. a compact woman in field boots with grey hair pulled under a ball cap, and with her came a retired Army explosive ordnance technician named Leon Pike, who had the calm, blunt manner of a man who had spent half his life telling people not to touch things that could remove their hands. We walked the fence for 4 hours. Leon pointed with a folded map instead of his finger, which told me more than any speech could have. He showed me where the impact zone cut across the low hill, where old ordnance had been recovered in the 90s, where the soil washed after heavy rain, and where the Walder Creek residents had apparently been entering through a gap behind their stormwater pond. I stood there staring at a faint footpath pressed into my grass, and for one idly second I imagined my grandfather watching from the ridge, cane in hand, seeing strangers stroll into the field that had taken part of him because a woman with a newsletter wanted a prettier Easter photo. Leon must have seen something on my face because he said, "Mr. Harlan, anger is fine. Just do not let it make you sloppy." That was good advice. It was also exactly the kind of advice I hated because it was correct. Denise helped me draft a new warning sign that afternoon. Not one of Amos's hand-painted boards, but a federal compliant notice with the restriction code, hazard language, contact number, and a line stating that unauthorized entry could trigger federal enforcement. We bolted it to the lower gate at 6:20 the next morning. I remember the sound of the drill biting into metal, sharp and final, and I remember Leon stepping back, sipping gas station coffee and saying, "Well, that ought to ruin somebody's breakfast." He was right. By 8:42, Marla Whitcomb was at my gate with Deputy Aaron Bell, holding a phone in one hand and a printed photograph of the sign in the other, acting like she'd discovered a counterfeit passport in my hayfield. Deputy Bell was young, polite, and clearly hoping this was just another rural property argument involving somebody's fence line and somebody else's pride. Marla did not give him that luxury. She said, "Deputy, this man is attempting to intimidate an entire residential community with fabricated federal signage. He has been hostile since arriving here, and frankly, I'm concerned about his state of mind." That last part was for me, of course. Marla was good at that, slipping a little poison into a sentence and pretending it was concern. I said, "Deputy, before anyone diagnoses my state of mind, you may want to read this." I handed him the memorandum and the certified receipts. He read in silence, and with every page his posture changed. His shoulders dropped first, then his mouth tightened. Then he looked back at Marla with the cautious expression of a man realizing the person who called him might have brought him a live grenade and asked him to juggle it. Marla crossed her arms and said, "I hope you understand that he has a history with federal paperwork. He is retired. Some people retire and need importance." Deputy Bell did not smile. He said, "Mrs. May Whitcomb, did you sign these receipts?" She blinked once, then said, "I sign many things for the association." "That is not an answer." Deputy Bell said it gently, which made it worse. She looked at me then, really looked, and the warmth vanished from her face. "You have no right to ambush this community," she said. I said, "Marla, the first letter was sent 5 years ago. That was the ambush." For once she had nothing ready, not immediately. Then she recovered, because people like Marla always have a second mask within reach. She told Deputy Bell the HOA had relied on years of open use, that Amos had never objected directly to their events, that families had built memories there, and that removing access without community review was vindictive. I almost laughed, but I thought of Amos alone in that farmhouse, too tired in his last years to fight a woman who had already decided his silence meant surrender. Deputy Bell stepped away to call his sergeant. Marla stayed at the gate with me, gravel between us, frost lifting off the weeds, the new sign bright on the metal bars. She lowered her voice and said, "You do not know what you are doing." I said, "I know exactly what I am doing." She smiled then, a thin little blade of a smile, and said, "No, Caleb, you know paperwork. I know people. And people are tired of old men using fear to control land they cannot even maintain." That sentence hit harder than I expected, not because it was true, but because it was aimed at the part of me that still felt like a caretaker arriving too late, a widower in his dead brother's kitchen, surrounded by files instead of family. For a second I wanted to answer mean. I wanted to tell her the only thing she maintained was her own reflection. But Ellen's voice in my head said, "Clean line, Caleb, stay on the clean line." So I said, "Marla, you put children on a restricted ordnance field after receiving federal warnings. Whatever happens now, you earned it in writing." Deputy Bell came back 15 minutes later and asked Marla to return to his cruiser. He did not arrest her. Not then, But he did tell her the county would be referring the incident to federal authorities, and he did tell her not to enter the property or encourage any resident to enter it, and when she tried to interrupt him, he held up one hand and said, "Ma'am, this is no longer an HOA matter." I have seen powerful people hear the word no before, but I had never seen one look so offended by the existence of reality. She left in the cruiser, sitting rigid in the passenger seat like she had been kidnapped by procedure. By sundown, my phone had 23 messages. 3 from Alder Creek board members, 5 from residents demanding clarification, 2 from people accusing me of destroying community traditions, 1 from a man named Brent who called me a federal scarecrow, which I admit was at least creative, and 1 voicemail from a woman named Nora Kessler that I saved before I even finished listening. Nora lived on Briar Lane, second house from the pond. She had been the HOA secretary for 2 years before Marla pushed her out. Her voicemail was quiet. She said, "Mr. Harlan, I have records you need to see. Please do not tell Marla I called." I drove to Nora's house the next afternoon. She met me at the side door, not the front, because fear has architecture, and in HOA neighborhoods it often uses side doors and lowered blinds. Nora was in her 70s, a retired school librarian with careful hands and eyes that had learned to measure people before trusting them. She made tea she did not drink and placed a blue folder between us. Inside was 6 years of HOA newsletters, event calendars, internal emails, screenshots from Marla's private board messages, and notes from meetings where residents had raised concerns about the lower meadow. There were emails from Nora asking whether the Army warnings should be shared with homeowners. There were replies from Marla saying disclosure would cause unnecessary panic, harm property values, and embolden Mr. Harlan's brother in his campaign of obstruction. Amos had never run a campaign of anything. Amos barely answered the phone after 8 at night, but there he was in Marla's private messages, turned into a villain so she could sell trespassing as community spirit. Nora watched me read. At one point she said, "I should have fought harder." I told her, "Nora, people like Marla count on decent people blaming themselves for not stopping them sooner. That is how they keep doing it." She cried then, quietly, embarrassed by her own tears, and I looked away because dignity matters most when somebody thinks they've misplaced it. By Friday morning, Denise Calder had Nora's folder. By Friday afternoon, a federal investigator named Marcus Vale called me from the regional office and asked if I would be willing to make a formal statement. His voice was polite, but there was steel underneath it. He told me they were reviewing possible charges related to willful violation of restricted land use, obstruction of federal administration, false representations in HOA communications, and reckless endangerment connected to minor children attending events on the pasture. Hearing those words out loud made the kitchen feel smaller. I had wanted the trespassing stopped. I had wanted the truth recorded. But federal charges are not offense repair. They are a storm system. Once they form, everybody in the valley feels the weather. That weekend, my daughter Grace drove in from Roanoke with her husband and their little boy, Owen. Grace found me at the table surrounded by documents and said, "Dad, you look like a man trying to outstare a courthouse." I said, "I might be." She sat with me until midnight, reading the warnings, Nora's emails, Amos's notes, my grandfather's hospital record, and when she finished, she put her hand on the old cedar chest and said, "Uncle Amos was not guarding land, was he?" I said, "No. He was guarding people who did not know enough to be grateful." 2 weeks later, notices went out for a public information meeting at the Randolph County Civic Hall. Federal officials would explain the land restriction, the ordnance hazard, the investigation, and the HOA's documented history of warnings. Alder Creek exploded before the meeting even happened. Neighbors stopped waving. Anonymous posts appeared online calling me bitter, unstable, greedy, anti-family, anti-community, and my personal favorite, a relic with a revenge fantasy. Marla sent one final email to the whole neighborhood at 11:38 on a Sunday night, saying she had always acted to preserve resident access against intimidation, that federal classifications were being misrepresented, and that certain outsiders were exploiting tragedy for control. She did not name me. She did not have to. I printed the email, placed it in the folder, and slept better than I expected, because there is a strange peace that comes when a liar finally writes the lie down. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 6:30. By 5:45, the parking lot was full. By 6:15, people were standing along the walls. At 6:28, Marla walked in with 2 attorneys, her husband behind her, and the same cream-colored vest she had worn at my gate, like a costume from the morning she thought she was still in charge. She looked across the room and found me near the front beside Denise, Leon, Nora, and my daughter Grace. For 1 second our eyes met, and I saw it there. Not guilt, not fear exactly, but calculation under pressure. She still believed there was a version of the room she could win. Then Marcus Vale stepped up to the microphone, tapped it once and said, "Good evening, everyone. We are here tonight because 5 federal warnings were issued, 5 warnings were received, and none of you were told." The room made a sound I will never forget after Marcus Vale said that. Not a gasp exactly, more like 300 people realizing at the same time that the floor under their neighborhood had not been solid for years. Chairs creaked, someone whispered, "Oh my God." A man at the back said, "What warnings?" And Marla Whitcomb sat in the 3rd row between her 2 attorneys with her chin lifted so high I thought pride itself might need a neck brace. Marcus did not dramatize it. Federal investigators rarely do. They do not have to. He placed the first certified receipt on the projector screen, then the second, then the 3rd, 4th, and 5th, and every one of them had Marla's signature at the bottom. The same signature residents had seen on holiday newsletters, violation notices, pool access memos, and cheerful little updates about community togetherness. Denise Calder spoke next. She explained the range history, the 1940s military lease, the incomplete clearance, the ordnance recoveries, the land use restriction, and the fact that no federal agency had ever authorized all the creek to use the lower pasture for any gathering of any size. Leon Pike followed her with a steel case on the table beside him. He opened it slowly, the way a preacher opens a Bible at a funeral, and lifted out an inert shell casing about the size of a tall soup can. He held it up under the Civic Hall lights and said, "This is not the exact shell found on Mr. Harlan's land. This one is safe. It has been rendered inert for training purposes, but live versions of this type have been recovered from that pasture. And live means live until a qualified team proves otherwise." The silence after that was heavier than anger. Anger still gives people something to do. Silence just leaves them alone with what they allowed themselves not to know. I was scheduled to speak for 7 minutes. Grace had helped me cut my remarks down because, as she put it, "Dad, nobody needs the full Department of Interior version of your feelings." She was right, so I walked to the microphone with one folder in my hand. No speech on paper, just my father's letter to Amos and my grandfather's hospital discharge copy folded behind it. I looked at the Alder Creek residents first. Not Marla, not the attorneys, the residents. Because most of them had not signed anything. Most of them had not concealed anything. Most of them had just believed what a confident person told them. I said, "My grandfather stepped onto that pasture in 1947 because the army told him the land was cleared. He paid for that mistake with his body. My brother spent the rest of his life making sure nobody else's child paid for it with theirs. That is the whole story, really. Everything else is paperwork." A woman near the center aisle started crying. I kept going, because if I stopped I was afraid I might join her. I told them Amos had never hated their neighborhood. He had never wanted to keep children from joy or families from picnics. He had wanted them alive. I held up the first warning receipt and said, "This was signed in 2019. I held up the second and said, "This was signed after the fall festival." The 3rd came after a children's nature walk. The 4th after movie night. The 5th after residents were again seen entering through the stormwater path. Every time the federal government warned your board, the warning stopped at one desk. Marla leaned toward one of her attorneys and whispered something. He did not whisper back. That was when Nora Kessler stood from the 2nd row. She had not planned to speak, or if she had not told me. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was clear in that old librarian way. Gentle enough for story hour, sharp enough to stop a knife fight if needed. She said, "I asked Marla to disclose the letters. I asked more than once. I was told disclosure would damage property values and create panic." Then she turned slowly toward the 3rd row. "Marla, you told us Mr. Amos Harlan was unstable. Told us he was exaggerating. You told us the meadow was safe enough for children as long as nobody dug holes. My grandson flew a kite there in 2021. He was 6. Marla did not look at Nora. She looked at the projector screen, where her own signature was still enlarged behind us, 20 feet wide and impossible to charm. Leon stepped off the small stage then and asked Nora where her grandson was sitting. She pointed to a boy near the aisle in a red hoodie, maybe 10 years old now, all knees and wide eyes. Leon crouched in front of him and said, "Buddy, I am glad you are here." Then he looked around the room and said, That is the point of restrictions like this. Not fear, prevention. We do not wait for a child to prove a warning was valid. We obey the warning so the child grows up. That was the moment the rune turned. Not legally, the law had already turned, but morally. You could feel it pass from row to row. People stopped looking at me like the man who had taken their meadow away and started looking at Marla like the woman who had gambled with their children because she did not want ugly facts lowering pretty home values. Marla finally stood. One attorney grabbed her sleeve, but she pulled free and said, "This is a coordinated attack." Her voice cracked on attack. She heard it too and tried to harden it. She said, "I served this community for years. I built our traditions. I protected our reputation. And yes, I received letters. But agencies send letters all the time. They threaten. They overstate. They cover themselves." Somebody shouted, "You let my kids play there." Another voice, then another, rose behind it. Marcus Vale lifted one hand and the room settled just enough for him to say, "Mrs. Whitcomb, your counsel has received the indictment returned this afternoon. You are scheduled to appear tomorrow morning before the federal magistrate in Charleston. I strongly advise you not to make further statements in this room." For the first time since I had known her, Marla looked small, not humble. Small, there is a difference. Humility opens a door. Smallness just looks for a corner. Her husband stared at the floor. Her attorney stood on either side of her like men guarding a candle in bad weather. And I, God help me, did not feel the triumph I thought I might. I felt relief, yes, and some satisfaction too, because I am human, and I had earned at least that much. But mostly I felt Amos beside me in that quiet way. The dead sometimes stand with us when the living finally hear what they tried to say. Marla eventually pled guilty to several federal counts. She lost her position, paid a fine large enough to make every Alder Creek budget meeting painful for a decade, and was barred from serving on any community board again. The developer who had sold those meadow views without disclosing the old federal caution letter was charged later, and his plea was quieter but no less expensive. Alder Creek recalled the entire board before Thanksgiving. Nora became interim president, which she accepted with the expression of a woman being handed a mop after a flood. Her first act was to mail every household a full restriction file and a handwritten note that began, "We should have known, and now we do." The federal cleanup began the next spring. They recovered more buried material than anyone wanted to admit was still there. I donated the lower pasture into a conservation trust once the process was underway, with one condition. After remediation, it would become a small public history site, not a playground, not a wedding meadow, not an HOA amenity, but a place where children could stand safely behind a rail and learn that land remembers what people prefer to forget. I still live on the farm. Grace brings Owen up most months, and he knows the fence rule by heart. We do not cross the lower pasture until the people who know better say it is clean. Last October, we stood at the gate while the new bronze marker was installed, and Owen asked if Great Uncle Amos would have liked it. I told him Amos would have complained about the cost, checked whether the bolts were straight, and then pretended not to cry. That is about as Harmon as it gets. As for Marla, some folks still say she was made an example of, that the federal government came down too hard, that she was just trying to build community and protect property values. Maybe you agree with them. Maybe you think a warning is only real after something explodes. I do not. I think the truth signed for and hidden is not a misunderstanding. It is a choice. And when that choice puts children in a field full of old shells, the bill always comes due. So tell me in the comments, was Marla a criminal, a coward, or just another HOA president who believed her own authority mattered more than everybody else's safety? And if your neighborhood, your HOA, or your town ever tried to claim land that was not theirs, or ignored a danger because it was inconvenient, drop your state and tell the story. I read everyone. Share this with somebody who thinks paperwork cannot fight back, because sometimes the quietest document in the drawer is the one that burns the whole lie down. Subscribe, and I will see you in the next story.